Hi guys, thank you for opening this up and getting started on your math. I appreciate that as always. I put on here to get your study guide and intervention worksheet out. You'll also need your notebook. Just for a quick little note in there, make sure you're labeling your notes, lesson 3 and the date that you write this down, just like you would as if we were in class. So the most important thing about this lesson, and this is one of those things that you're going to use in Algebra 1, in Geometry, in Algebra 2, Calculus, Pre-Calculus, anything like that, you'll need to know this. There's a couple things that this slide is missing, though, that we're going to add. So slope is how much you're going up or down. It's how much your line is rising or falling, as I think we've talked a little bit about before. But so when we're talking about slope, we call it M sometimes. And the slope is your rise/fall. The way they describe it that I want you to write down too is that it's the change in Y. How much are you going up or down? So you're either rising or you're falling. You're falling when it's negative and you're rising when it's positive. Just like if you were to talk about money, if you go into the negatives, you go down. You go into the positives, you go up. So it's rise/fall over run. I will remind you too that when we have a graph, you always read it from left to right like a book. So it's rise/fall over run, or we have an equation that we're going to use now in order to solve for some unknowns. So our equation is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. For some reason my mouse wanted to continue, but y2 minus y1 and x2 minus x1. So there are 1, 2, 3 ways to write slope at this point, or it's just your y over your x. Usually when we talk about points, we're talking about x first, but in slope you always talk about your rise and run, so your y, or your rise/fall, so your y first. Another way to imagine this with this x1, y1, x2, y2 is that your points are basically like x sub 1, y sub 1, and x sub 2, y sub 2. Hopefully you're thinking to yourself, oh, there's ones together and twos together. That's talking about the first point, the ones, and the second point with the twos, because you'll be given two different points that you have to find the slope of. So pause this if you need to finish writing this down. I'm going to switch to the next slide. So the thing that it asks us to do first is to find the slope of a line that passes through the points. There are going to be 3 different ways that this happens. The first one is if you have one solution. So with one solution, you have a M. Sorry, I need to make this readable. One solution, that's my shorthand for solution. So one solution means you have a number. The other option is that you have no solution. No, not no solution, sorry. In graphing, we're going to call it undefined. I was just teaching a lesson on no solutions, so undefined. An undefined slope is talking about when we are trying to divide something by 0. You cannot give something out to 0 people. You will not be giving something out. If I said, I'm going to distribute $100 to 0 people, it doesn't work. You cannot put 0 into that. I'm just keeping the money. So undefined is when you have something like a number over 0, because you cannot divide by 0. Then you also could have a 0 slope. If it's the other way around, it's okay. So if you have 0 slope, this looks terrible, but that's all right. If you have a 0 slope, you might have something like 0 over 7. 0 divided by 7 is 0. You cannot divide by a 0 though, because that's like 0 divided by 7 is like 0 times 7, which we know is 0. 0 of something is 0, nothing. So just keep that in mind as you go through these. If you have one where you're dividing by 0, if you have a 0 in the denominator, it will be undefined. If you have a 0 in the numerator in the top, it'll be a 0 slope. So your m will just equal 0. Usually, though, we'll have one solution. So the first thing I want you to always, always, always do is label your points. So you're going to label it x sub 1, y sub 1. I cannot write very small, but that's all right. And then you're going to write x sub 2, y sub 2. This is just going to help you use your equation. Now, what I've been telling people is I want you to always write down what formula you're using. I've told you guys this before. I probably sound like a broken record, but the only way you're going to memorize formulas is if you write them down over and over again. This is how I've memorized all formulas in math, is just writing them over and over and over again. Every single time I did a problem, I wrote down the formula. 1, to make sure I didn't mess up, but 2, so I could help memorize them so I didn't have to keep looking over. So our equation for our slope, as we wrote down before, is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So our slope in this case, m equals, now I'm just going to check out what I wrote y2 next to. Y sub 2 is 6 because I wrote it next to the 6. Then my formula says minus y1. So minus my y sub 1 I wrote above the 9. So our y sub 1 is 9. You guys missed that sound. I'm late for my next class, apparently. And then we're going to write down our x sub 2, which I wrote is 1, minus my x sub 1, which is 4. That's why we label them, so they're really easy to find when we want to plug them into our slope. So 6 minus 9 is negative 3. 1 minus 4 is also negative 3. So our slope ends up just being 1. I'm going to do number 4 next, just to show you what that looks like. So again, you'll write down your slope formula. And you'll also label each part of the point. And then you're going to plug it in. Let me move myself here. So let's plug it into our equation. So our m equals my y sub 2, it says is negative 5. Put negative 5 first. Then I'm going to find my y sub 1. So my y sub 1 here is negative 1. Now, when you think about it, minus a negative, 2 negatives always make a positive. So instead of minus 1, you're going to have plus 1. Then in the denominator, we start with x sub 2, which I can find is right here. And I labeled it to be negative 4. The next thing we're going to do is look at our x sub 1, which is also negative 4. However, in our formula, we have x sub 2 minus x sub 1. So minus a negative becomes plus 4. This actually ends up being negative 5 plus 1 is negative 4. But negative 4 plus 4 ends up being 0. So this is an example of what I was talking about before with your different kinds of slopes. You are not allowed to divide by a negative number. It causes mathematical explosions. Mathematicians do not like it when you do that. So you cannot. So all you have to say here is undefined. For short, I usually put just undefined. Undefined slopes look like this. It's like falling off of a cliff. A 0 slope means you go 0 up or down, and so it's just a horizontal line. And that's how you do those problems. The next thing we're going to do is the other type. So if you need to pause this, pause it. I'm going to move to the next slide. So the other part of this that we're going to do is when you have to solve for an unknown. So our generic equation is this m equals, you guys are going to be sick of me saying it by the end of this, but that's all right. It's going to really help you memorize it. Also, that's not 2y or y2, it's y sub 2. I sometimes slip and say y2 as well, but I would prefer if you say x sub 2 minus x sub 1. That's kind of the more accurate description. So when you have this, we're going to also label our points exactly like we did in the previous slide. So x1, y1. Be very careful not to do x2 or x1, x2, y1, y2, because you always have x comma y. You don't have both x's together and both y's together. You have a combination of both. So I'm going to plug everything I know into this equation. In this case, I have m, which is 3/4. Then I also have my y sub 2, it says is r. So I'm just going to put in r. Minus my y sub 1, which was -3. Minus a negative becomes positive. Then we have x sub 2, which it says is 7. And then we have minus -1, which is +1. We have something interesting that happens here. If you think back a couple lessons to your ratios problems, this ends up actually looking exactly like the ratio problems we've had. What you can do here is find the cross product or cross multiply. So you're going to do 4 times r plus 3 and 3 times 8. So I'm just switching colors just so you can see. So 4 times r plus 3. I'm not going to multiply or distribute it out because remember there is an easier way to do that. Then you have that equal to 3 times 8, which is 24. This looks not the greatest of writing, but that's all right. So the first thing I'm going to do when I look at this left side, I know I need to get r by itself, but it's stuck in this in the parentheses in this grouping symbol. So this is like 4 times that. So I want to do the inverse of that, which is dividing. So the first thing you're going to do is divide by both sides. Just like we did in lesson, I believe it was 2-7. 24 divided by 4 is 6. And now we have a simple 2 or 1-step equation now. I want to move +3. I subtract 3 on both sides. And my r equals 3. And that's it. That's how you do those problems. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch this. I know it's not the first thing on your priority list. We don't all have to wake up and say, yay, math. But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're learning. Please reach out to me on Remind, email, Google Classroom. Send a comment if you need any help on this. I'm happy to meet up with you. I also have office hours that I set in our Google Meets. So right now my office hours are Tuesdays from 1 to 4:30 and Thursdays from 9 to 12. So you could either come in the morning on Thursdays or the afternoon on Tuesdays, or you could come both days. It depends on how much help you want, but I'll be available during that time. If you want to meet at a separate time, if that time does not work for you, feel free to just email me or message me on Remind. I'm pretty available. I'm making myself pretty available to you guys for help, so don't suffer in silence. It's not fun to suffer in silence on math by yourself. I know the feeling. Don't do it. It's a trap. All right. Have a good day, guys. See ya.